You might be thinking, oh, come on, that's obvious. A thick metal barrier, it ain't complicated. But how thick exactly? Maybe it's thinner than you think, or thicker. And perhaps other important factors worth elaborating on. I'm going to tell you a lot about that, but first, your finger's hovering, isn't it? In anticipation of a sponsorship to skip, except there is none. What do they say? A new patron a day keeps the sponsorships away, so you know what to do. I just realized that saying you know what to do and pointing down seems a little odd out of context. Good thing that I'm pretty sure you're aware of the importance of context. All right, that's enough silly intro. So everybody loves thick breastplates, right? But how thick were they exactly? Well, it really does depend, not only on the time period and the particular armor, but even specific areas within the same armor. So there's a very helpful article on allenantiques.com, which I'll link down below, along with the other sources, which, by the way, mentions an important point to keep in mind, the fact that there can be some material loss over time. So some armors might be just slightly thinner than they used to be. Big difference? Probably not if they look like they're in decent condition. There's a breastplate from 1500 with significant differences in thickness within the same piece. The thinnest area is 0.76 millimeters thick, or thin rather, which is 0.028 inches. Can we just agree that inches don't work for such small measurements? So that's about 22 gauge. That seems almost flimsy. Well, the thickest part is 2.8 millimeters, about 1/10 of an inch, or like 12-ish gauge, which is pretty substantial. Winding time forward a century, in 1600, this breastplate here has a dent from shotproofing. In this case, the thinnest area is 2.64 millimeters thick, again, roughly 1/10 of an inch, and the thickest is 7.24 millimeters, which is 0.285 inches. So at that point, it's so thick it's outside of the steel gauge chart. The difference is blatantly obvious. The thinnest part of the 1600s armor is about the same as the thickest part of the 1500 armor. That's a development brought to you by the terrific trio, saltpeter, sulfur, and charcoal. They're on fire. That's the reason why they kept making them thicker and thicker. Guns became more and more prominent and better as well, so the older armor just didn't cut it. It just wouldn't protect you against getting shot. Why didn't those dummies make armor extra thick and protective to begin with? Because it sucks to wear. It comes at the expense of extra weight. How much more? Well, in case of the breastplate from 1600, it weighs 6.65 kilograms or 14 pounds, 7.5 ounces. To put that into perspective, 15th century cuirass, some people say cuirass. By the way, if you ever wondered what the difference is between a cuirass and a breastplate, a cuirass has a breastplate, but also the back plate, whereas the breastplate is just the front. And also, cuirass can be made of other materials, so that one weighs 2.34 kilograms or 5 pounds, 2.5 ounces. Plus the back plate, which weighs 3.64 kilograms or 8 pounds to make the whole cuirass. So in other words, the 1600s breastplate, just the front, weighs about as much or even a little bit more than the front and back combined for the earlier 15th century. Let's do a deep dive into thickness. There's an article by Lazar and Craner from 2019, which is behind a paywall, and I don't have permission to use it. So I'm not going to show you anything specifically from it, although I will link it with the sources, but I'm just going to sum up what I learned from it. So they mapped the thickness of body armor from the early 16th to the mid-19th century. The thickness measurements run the gamut from about 0.5 millimeter, I have to wonder if you can just dent that with your finger, all the way to under 8 millimeters, which is a staggering spectrum. There's variation within the same time period, but generally as you go on, they become sturdier. The thickest and heaviest armor in this lineup is from 1600, which goes from 1.1 to 5.9 millimeters, which is 0.04 inches or about 19 gauge, to almost a 1/4 inch or like 3 or 4 gauge. And the second thickest is from the mid-19th century, which is very similar, almost the same. When I think about the hand-forged plate I tested in 2018, that thing seemed borderline indestructible. Everything we did to it had pretty much no effect other than destroying the things we tested on it. So that turned out between 2 and 2.5 millimeters. It seemed way too thick to me at the time, but even for 15th century, that wouldn't be out of the ordinary, at least when it comes to the thicker parts of the armor. And that's kind of where the problem lies. When they mapped the thickness, it becomes very obvious that it depends a lot on which part. So typically the center of the armor is thicker, and then toward the sides it thins out, usually. But even then there can be some differences. Like, for example, there was one armor where they found that the left side was thicker than the right side, and sometimes the lower part, like the abdominal area, is thicker and protrudes more, not to accommodate a gut, but well, we'll get to that in a moment. There's something called a Peascott armor, which tapers and protrudes. Sometimes it's particularly heavy around the abdominal area, and sometimes it's the entire chest as well. This is also seen in doublets of the mid-16th and early 17th century. Some say that the armor mimicked the fashion, but I would argue it seems more plausible that it's the other way around, that this is actually a functional part of the armor, and then fashion imitated that, to make it look like your civilian outfit look like armor. That's one of the big parts that make breastplates work. When you have a ramp, or two ramps basically, that meet in the middle, and it's particularly thick in the middle. The point of all that is that if you're being hit particularly by a bullet, but anything really, a weapon, a melee weapon or whatever, it's the thickest part which it can't penetrate and can't really bite into too well, and then the slopes create a ramp for the weapon to slide off. So rather than absorbing the full brunt of the force, which you would if it was completely flat, it is being redirected. So it glances off. Very useful. The waist can be kind of cinched in. I wonder what it's like to have a waist. This kind of deflection makes a big difference. Now there's one catch, or rather something that needs a catch, which is when you deflect a weapon, it's going somewhere, right? So depending on where you get hit and at what angle, whether it be with a thrust from a polearm or a sword or an arrow or what have you, what if it comes from below, right into your face or your neck? That's why they implemented the feature pretty early on. You see that already in the Churburg armor from 1380, which is this sort of V-shaped ridge that is attached to the surface of the armor, just so you don't have that happen. So if something glances off and comes upward, rather than getting stabbed in the throat, it'll either stop that or redirect it. And then in addition to that, the edge of the top there is also rolled over. That is a very important standard part of armor design. Thickened rims or rolled edges in some form. Even if you look at this very simple breastplate here from 1510, that's what you might call munitions grade. No bells and whistles, just it's pretty flat. It doesn't have a central ridge or anything. It doesn't seem to be that strongly tapered. It's a pretty basic plate, but even that has rolled edges. Kind of crudely done, just to keep the costs down and crank it out quickly, but even this has that feature because it's that important. You often have that at the bottom of the armor too. It can extend into a flange or fold. If a thrust or an arrow or a bullet is deflected and glances off, you can imagine where that might go, and that's probably not what you want.
You don't say!
Sometimes you have an arrangement of ridges which can be seen as purely decorative, and maybe they were, but I suspect that they also have this sort of practical function to stop something from skidding all over the place and going into your shoulder or your throat or whatever. The big problem with that, of course, is while the body armor is rigid and the most protective, what you have elsewhere is not as protective. The limb armor was quite a bit thinner, and of course, because you need to be able to move your arms and cross them, there are always going to be cutouts, and so you may only have mail there or smaller flexible plates, things of that nature. So that tends to be the weak spots. So if something glances off from here and goes right into your armpit, That's one of those weak spots. On 15th and 16th century armor, most gaps may be quite effectively covered, and a pointy blade that goes toward one of those might be stopped by the thickened rims at the edges. While looking at this Italian suit of armor from between 1400 and 1450, I'm thinking the cloth cover would limit how much weapons might glance off, and softer armor is also more likely to dent than deflect, which I'd argue is less of a problem for melee weapons than for projectiles. Unless we're talking spikes or beaks, which of course are designed to bite into the armor instead of glancing off. With the rise of firearms, we see more strongly curved breastplates which are better at deflection, which makes sense. So yeah, at the end of the day, it is simply a metal barrier between your delicate flesh and whatever offensive implement is trying to tear into it. But it's a little bit more complicated than that. There's plenty that goes into it. And one thing I haven't even touched on, which is the whole metallurgical aspect that, well, you have to ask somebody who knows more about these things. But essentially, you have to also optimize the heat treatment to make it as hard as possible without being brittle so that it doesn't dent and deform easily, but it's not going to crack or chip or what have you. There's plenty of optimization that could be done and was done. They could have made everything roughly the same thickness. Of course, when it's handmade, it's not going to be as precisely uniform as rolled steel, but they could have made either everything thick, which would have made the entire thing unbearably heavy, or they could have kind of evened it out, take the average of the thickest and the thinnest, make it even, but then you're not getting as much protection in the most crucial areas. So it's actually more useful to have an extremely thick part in the center of the chest and pretty thin areas on the sides. And the backplate can be thinner because chances are you're not going to be attacked from behind as often, hopefully. Although in one case, the backplate was actually thicker than the front. But from what I understand, it's usually the other way around. So they really thought it out and optimized as much as possible, min-maxed the armor to increase their odds of survival. It's almost like there's some kind of natural incentive to try to maximize something that you trust with your life. I don't know. Anyway, hope you found this interesting. Thanks for watching and stay safe. Well, the difference between a breastplate sounds vaguely naughty, I don't know. That's probably just me. 0.75 millimeters, 7.6. Can we just agree that inches don't work for such small measurements? Measurements? Why am I so mush-mouthed? Measurements? Inches don't work for such... Talking is hard. 15th century... Cure ass.